I was appalled also to find out that the government is proposing to remove the ability of people who live outside a specific area to be able to comment on environmental issues. So my question to you is, I think it was Brandis, wasn't it, the Attorney General that said that?
Erica Betts did that, yes.
Erica Betts too. Yes. So what is the best way that we can attack the government on this issue to make sure that they do not take that step?
We're already seeing extremely fierce opposition to Brandis's suggestion. I think even for Conservatives, this is overreach. And we can see that when even Alan Jones is coming out and saying, look, farmers oppose these changes, because that means a farmer whose land will be affected by a project that happens maybe not in the immediate vicinity, but in the region, cannot appeal that decision, cannot have any say in that process. They're saying that's not acceptable. That is fundamentally a betrayal of every Australian citizen to have a say over their future. And so I think this is an issue where the coalition's overreach has become abundantly clear. So we're seeing the environment movement is united on this front. Farmers are united on this front. We've seen the Labor government say they'll block it. The Greens will block it. A few crossbenchers will block it. Basically, we just have to, all of us, again, get all of our bits of power, put them together and show the government this is unacceptable. If anything, we should be strengthening our environmental protection laws, not weakening them.
Hey Banjo, have you heard, mate? What is happening to the run, where you rode with old Pat Riley neath the hot Monaro sun, where you stirred your pipe and choked it, thumped a wad of weed and stoked it, lit the flames that lit the pictures in the minds of everyone. Fresh from chambers, Lawyer Banjo, surely you would yarn with old Pat Riley as he talked of the old fella and his plans for Kylie's run. The old fella, Bill, a Kylie from our old island, tough and wily. Ticket a leave man sent to Sydney with a dray and an axe and a gun. And Banjo, you'll remember each blooming, sweet September, how you bid the streets of Sydney and an eager, fond farewell. The rest of the poem's about how Kylie's run becomes a Pinus radiatus plantation courtesy of the New South Wales government under the Rand era. But that's a Dennis Kevin's poem about saving Kylie's run as Australian heritage. 73% of people last week voted against Galilee on a ABC PNN Parliamentary News Network 2-hour survey or vote online when the question was, should Galilee go ahead against environmental considerations when there are 30,000 jobs at stake? That's our ABC. 30,000 jobs at stake. Are there 30,000 jobs at stake? No. The second thing from last night's PM was the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, going on about vigilantes, legal vigilantes, you guys, legal vigilantes, and then one of his other ministers saying on PM last night, and this is it, not only are they vigilantes, but you guys are snakes and, not spiders, what was it, lizards. Can you explain what's at stake with the snakes and lizards reference?
Yeah, on the question of job numbers, just quickly, we have seen Tony Abbott this week come out and say 10,000 jobs over and over again, which is what Adani had initially put in their proposal. When Adani were in the Queensland Land Court a couple of months ago, they were asked in court, and in court they had to announce that it wasn't 10,000 jobs. One of their own staff said, in fact, their estimate is 1,400 jobs, 1,464, I think. So yeah, but the fact that we see still Tony Abbott this week saying 10,000 jobs, when in fact Adani's own staff have said in court that it's far less than that, I think paints a pretty clear picture of what's happening at the moment.
That's right, and so the exaggeration of the economic and jobs benefits of these sorts of projects has been obviously revealed in court in this particular case, but I also think it points to a bigger problem that it's a bipartisan kind of sense in Australia that all we can do is export commodities, that's kind of all Australia is good for. And so we see a massive exaggeration of the economic and social benefits that will flow to Australia from continued commodity export. And I just think it's time for Australia to lose that kind of, in a way, that colonial baggage that all we're good for is exporting back home, and to start diversifying, to start using the creativity and the diversity of Australian people. We've got brains, we've got hands, we can do other stuff. And in fact, in the long term, it will be much better for all of us and for our children. So that's on the jobs part. On the snakes and lizards, that's because when the Mackay Conservation Group, I assume this is the reference, their challenge to the approval of the Carmichael mine was that the conservation advice for two species called the yakka skink and the ornamental snake had been ignored, and under the EPBC Act, the minister's obliged to give attention to that conservation advice. He doesn't have to follow it, he just has to take it into account, and he forgot to do that. And so that's why kind of the yakka skink and the ornamental snake have sort of become emblems of environmental protection.
I think one of the most amazing things in the story you've each told is to get a big bank like the Commonwealth Bank or Standard Chartered to actually change its behaviour and change its course. So I guess my question is, do you think that's just driven by factors like corporate reputation or a fear by them that their customer base was being shaken? Or what are your insights on how you managed to get them to do that?
We tried a lot of different things, as you've heard, to get that result. And the whole time we were essentially working off 3 levels of risk that we had decided we needed to cause. So that was HR risk, so their own staff telling the bank that they didn't want to work on a project like this, or they weren't comfortable with the Commonwealth Bank or any of the big 4 investing in this. Financial risk, so that's, as I said before, the project itself is actually not a financially viable project. The AYCC is not a very convincing messenger of that. So we didn't focus ourselves on that, but there were a lot of other organisations bringing that message to the banks. And then reputational risk, as you said. So banks really care a lot about their brand. It's kind of, the thing they have going for them, the way they draw in customers, and they spend, huge amounts of money on advertising campaigns and, getting the best and brightest staff. And so, we always tried to look at our campaign as, making sure that across the board we were creating risk in those 3 areas.
Yeah, and so Ella's covered it, of course, very well. And all I'd add is, certainly in the case of Standard Chartered, reputational risk didn't seem to sway it in the UK. But what they were worried about was customers in Southeast Asia and East Asia, because that's where they want to grow. So it was customer pressure. So it was that combination of reputational risk and their direct financial interest. But I would also emphasise that they're smart. Like, they weren't going to make big returns on this project because we're in that end times for coal. If you believe a lot of analysts, we're in the structural decline of coal. The coal price has fallen dramatically. Peabody, which is one of the world's largest coal companies, has lost 90% of its share value in the last 12 months. So this is, banks, they do care about their reputation, but they don't care that much if there's a huge profit to be made. So I think they've seen the writing on the wall, and for them looking at it, it's like, well, it's not that profitable and we're going to get slammed for it. What's the point?
Thank you so much for a really inspiring presentation. It reminds us, that the creativity and the range of activities you've taken up have been really successful, and they're not out of any particular rule book, but just doing what works, and I think that's really terrific. What I'd like to ask is, to what extent either of you in your work have made efforts to engage unions in this work, and what response have you had, and to what extent do you think they can and should make a positive role in these struggles? It's
something that we're working on, and for our campaign we did talk to the Financial Services Union about the way we went about doing our campaign activities. And I think sort of less so for that campaign, but for some of the other work that we're doing, we're really trying to forge stronger links with unions. So at the moment, there's kind of a lot of mobilising and organising happening in the lead up to the Paris climate talks at the end of the year. And we're seeing something really exciting happen that hasn't happened ever before, which is that finally everybody is starting to come together and build a movement around this. So it's not just environmental groups driving these rallies, but already a lot of big health groups have come on board, and faith groups, and international aid and development organisations, which is really exciting, and unions. So there are already national partnerships with the Australian Manufacturers Workers Union, the National Union of Workers, the NTEU, and I think possibly a number of others since the last time I looked at the list. So there is, a lot of work being done to try to engage with unions on these things. The improvements, that Labor taking a much better renewable energy target of 50% by 2030 is really largely thanks to the CFMEU backing that policy. And so it's really important that environmental groups work with unions, and it's not something we necessarily do well very often, but I think it's something that we're all trying to do better.
I'll just go on from the Paris COP21. I just wanted to let everyone know that I'm going to the Paris COP21 Climate Festival, so politics in the pub is going to be represented there.
Whoa! Who's the lover?
Yes. So it is probably our last chance ever to get it right on climate change. The debates are over about the science. It's really about getting it right in terms of the renewable technologies. Now, what we have been discovering, so I'm going with the Climate Angels, Friends of the Earth, the Greens have joined up with us. Christine Milne and Larissa Waters are going to be working with us there as well. But what we have been discovering, and this is quite alarming, is that they are not giving accreditations to NGOs. And so it is kind of becoming primarily business. So my question, has your organisation managed to get an accreditation? The Climate Angels are a wonderful troupe. They're a theatre group that have really caught the attention of the press in Australia and around the world. They made the front page of the New York Times. They wear these amazing costumes with giant wings. Even Bill Shorten had to stop for a photo opportunity with them, and Larissa Waters has appeared a lot. So if you haven't got an accreditation, well then we all have to bind together and do something amazing.
I wonder if that's the only time Bill Shorten will encounter an angel. So I actually disagree that Paris is the last chance ever to get agreement and action on climate change. I fundamentally disagree. It's a chance, it's a moment, but we're going to win anyway. And I think what we saw at Copenhagen in 2009 was that the movement, the world, had put all of their faith into reaching an international agreement, and then when that didn't happen, because it's an international political moment at which nations acting in their self-interest get together and decide to act in their own self-interest so they don't reach an agreement for the good of the planet. That sounds really negative, but that's what happened last time, so there is every chance that will happen this time. And what we have to do is make sure that regardless of what happens in Paris, we're moving towards a 100% renewable energy future, we're moving towards no deforestation, we're moving towards the future whether or not they want to come with us or not.
Do you know anything about the history of Adani mining in terms of good governance and good operation? I mean, does it follow the rules in terms of labour laws, environmental laws, occupational health and safety, etc., etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question because the answer is no. I mean, Get Up did most of the campaigning around this, so I don't know a huge amount of detail around it, but their environmental record and their record of how they treat their workers is appalling. There are really terrible stories coming out of India about some of the projects that they've done there and their complete sort of destruction of the natural environment in areas where they've built coal-fired power stations, I think, and mines, ports as well. And yeah, so they have a really terrible environmental and record and economic record, and our government is aware of that, but Jess might have more detail.
Greenpeace as well have produced a number of briefings on Adani's record in India, and they are available on our website if you want to go and have a look. All I would add to that, I mean, they do have a record of kind of illegal construction of mines, failure to adhere to environmental conditions, and failure to comply with prosecution for that. They also have some really interesting accounting going on, and we know that companies associated with the Adani Group have been channeling money in offshore bank accounts. And I guess the third key point, so there are two reasons we don't want to trust them with our Great Barrier Reef, and we don't want to trust them to build a massive coal mine. But third, they lie. We know that they've lied to Australians repeatedly for years about the economic benefits of this project. So taken together, I think there's a pretty good reason not to give them the keys to the Galilee Basin or the Great Barrier Reef.
Firstly, about Adani, I think it's become more apparent that maybe they're happy to make their money by raising their capital value on the Indian stock market, selling out and using some of that interesting accounting to bail out before anybody finds out. And, anyhow, my question basically is, in terms of planning for what you're going to be doing over in Paris, there's a recent revelation that something like estimation that 4,000 Chinese people a day are dying prematurely because of respiratory illnesses related to particulate matter in the air from coal mines, etc. I think this is an issue I've been talking about this for a while, about the health costs and the health implications, and especially if people take some of these people to court, because I know some of these substances, like the diesel particulate matter in the air, has been graded as a class 1 carcinogen, which is the highest grade by the World Health Organization. So theoretically, you could sue people over this. So I'm just wondering, my question basically is in terms of strategies in that regard, and also the fact that India and China seem to be also pursuing a policy of energy self-sufficiency with their coal mines, and with the lowering of the coal price and our high wage structure here, it makes more sense for them to actually, even though they've got low-grade coal, to actually do it over there, because on the cost benefit it's a lot cheaper for them. So on those two fronts, have you thought about doing that over in Paris, or pushing that agenda in Paris?
It's a really good point, the health implications of coal-fired power. And I know, for example, in the US, there was a study that came out 2 years ago that 10,000 people a year die from illnesses related to air pollution caused by coal-fired power. And it's certainly something that has driven climate action in China. I think from what I understand from my Chinese colleagues in Greenpeace China, that was the primary driver for the Chinese government taking the strong actions they have recently to cut down on coal-fired power generation. But I also think it's really important because it goes to this myth that we hear all the time in Australia, from Tony Abbott down, that coal is good for the poor, it's good for humanity, and it's what's going to lift, people in miserable poverty into great lives. And I think that talking about the health impacts shows what absolute irresponsible rubbish that is, because the people that are the poorest people in India that don't have access to power at the moment are not going to suddenly get clean, cheap electricity from more coal-fired power. They're the people that are the most likely to be struck down by respiratory illnesses. We already know that the people that live in close proximity to coal mines then just have another obstacle to overcome because their health is affected. So I think it's really important that we talk about the fact that coal-fired power generation is often disastrous for the poor, and that's why what we should be doing is giving them renewable and healthy solutions, and that is our responsibility in kind of wealthy, developed nations to be helping them with that transition. Sorry, I could go on for ages because it's something I feel very strongly about, but I'll pass over.
Yeah, I really want to echo what Jess said. It's a really important point. And in response to our government constantly saying things like coal is good for humanity, we're seeing a flood of activists in countries like India and China coming out and disagreeing with them and saying that it's not what they need in their countries, and it's not what lifts people out of poverty. And I think there's another sort of myth that you touched on that it's important to address, which is that China and India are really the problem here, and they're still burning huge amounts of coal, and this has an impact on how countries act in forums like the Paris climate talks. And both India and China have made very clear that they are still burning huge amounts of coal, but they're moving rapidly towards renewable energy too, much more rapidly than Australia is. And a lot of it is due to pragmatism as well. Rapid development requires, steady access to power. And in the industries and the economies of the future, that means renewable energy. So we're also seeing we're actually seeing a lot of uptake of renewable energy in places like India and China. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind when we listen to the way our political leaders talk about what the rest of the world is doing.
This last Saturday, my letter appeared in the Sydney Morning Herald. The title was "A Subject of Ridicule. Tony Abbott is all pretense and no substance. He does not believe that man-made pollution significantly contributes to global weather change, and he feels that if he personally attends the climate change conference in Paris, he would be criticized and be subject to ridicule by several world leaders about the minimal contribution that is proposes to make." Now, I really believe that individuals can do all kinds of things which is good for the climate. For instance, on my roof, I have panels that create hot water, panels that create electricity, I've got insulation, and so on. And my son actually saw last week Joe Hockey, because he's in Joe Hockey's electorate. I am in Tony Abbott's electorate, and I keep on sending him letters and I go to public meetings and make a fool of Tony Abbott, which is amazingly very, very easy. My son and his friends and other friends of mine, they shifted their money from the Commonwealth Bank, and they told the bank why they are doing it. If individuals can play an active role, I keep on sending letters to Tony Abbott all the time.
Well, Andrew, I just want to say that I think we're all in awe of what you have given us as an example. Age is no limit to being an activist. Your example should be followed by all of us who are a bit older. I mean, the young people are leading us, but we've all also not just leave it to the young people.
I want you to comment about democracy or democratic processes that are involved in what you're doing, with particular reference to the threat by the government to your tax deductibility status. But there's also part of the criticism that's coming through just now is that the mine in central Queensland is being opposed and funded interstate but also internationally. So the role of Greenpeace as both an international player and a national player, have you got anything to speak about that with regard to our role as citizens in working with Greenpeace and other movements?
Thanks for your question. I'll just say two things quickly. Greenpeace Australia Pacific is funded by about 70,000 Australian men and women who give us small monthly donations. And so this isn't an attack on Greenpeace. This is an attack on all of those mums and dads, like my mum, who growing up always gave $30 a month to Greenpeace to go out and protect the environment on her behalf. This is an attack on them. So while mining companies, coal companies can make tax-deductible donations to the Liberal Party or the National Party, everyday mum and dads can't make a tax-deductible donation to a public interest environment group. First thing. Second thing, what does it say about our rights as citizens? I think it just shows that this government is far more interested in protecting the interests of big business than it is in protecting the fundamental democratic rights of its citizens.
Obviously, thanks very much to both of you for marvellous presentations. It's great to see the emphasis on a sort of bottom-up, grassroots activism, real direct action, not the bogus direct action we hear from Tony Abbott. But meanwhile, of course, the Labour Party is still advocating a pricing mechanism to solve all these environmental and climate change challenges. The emissions trading system. Would you care to comment on whether the introduction of an ETS would be a useful adjunct, a top-down adjunct, no doubt, a market principle, a useful adjunct to your direct confrontation with the vested interests here, or is that largely irrelevant? And if so, what plan for a transition out of coal into renewables could be more effective than an emissions trading scheme?
I think there were quite a lot of big questions just asked there. The policies that the Labor Party currently have are nowhere near good enough. We're very happy to see that they're starting to differentiate themselves from the coalition, but they're nothing like what we need to see to avoid dangerous climate change, and the science is very clear on that. We need a reduction of 80% by 2030, really, if we have anything like a 75% chance of avoiding 2 degrees, and 2 degrees is not very good. But what we really need to start seeing is people addressing some of the things that we've been talking about today that really aren't being spoken about in the fossil fuel industry. So we need, in order to transition in the way that we need to start shutting down coal plants that are currently operating because there's an oversupply of energy in the market. So we really need politicians to start talking about that, because we can't build much more renewable energy unless we start shutting down some of the fossil fuel power that we currently have. And so we need to see our politicians starting to talk about this. And just quickly on one of the other questions that was asked, about the risk of the Australian government's stance on renewables.
You tell us that we've reached the end time for coal, and China and India are rapidly moving away towards renewable technologies. If Australia continues along the line of our reactionary addiction to big coal, subservience to big coal, what are the real risks that we will be left, in the words of an ex-Liberal Party leader, John Hewson, with stranded assets, with coal mines that produce coal that nobody wants?
Stranded assets is a big one, and it's something not just our government is facing, but like superannuation funds, banks, anything that your money is invested in is quite possibly investing in these things that are about to become stranded assets. But there's another big thing that isn't being talked about in the way that it should be, and that's jobs in Australia. So, you know, the government goes on and on about what's actually going to be 1,400 jobs created by the Carmichael mine, if that. But we've already lost something like 2,500 renewable energy jobs in Australia from the government's attack on the renewable energy target. And so it's not just, you know, financial risks, but it's risks to, you know, real people's jobs and jobs of the future. And we know that these are, you know, that renewable energy is one of the big industries of the future. And it's one of the sunniest and windiest countries in the world. We really need to create more of these jobs that are cleaner and healthier than the fossil fuel industry. And so I think that's probably the biggest risk of the current government's policies.
What about the carbon price, though?
I'm happy to take him from that.
Did everyone hear her question?
So on the question of the carbon price and what's the correct mechanism, I feel like it's the role of groups like Greenpeace to talk about what is needed to get the planet into the next century. So our job is to talk about what's the target that we need, and we know we need 80% emissions reduction about by 2030. With another hat on, I used to teach environmental law and policy, so I have a lot of opinions, personal opinions, about the comparative advantages of an ETS versus a carbon price and other things. But what I'd say is that my overriding sense is that we need a variety of mechanisms to reach that target. We need a kind of renewable energy target on steroids. We need a plan to phase out coal-fired power. We need probably some forms of energy efficiency standards. We need a suite of measures, but I feel like as environmental groups, our role is primarily to say these are the targets we need and to leave it to the experts to work out what's the right mechanism to get us there.
First, I'd like to thank both Ella and Jess for the really informative talks, and it's really encouraging everybody. My particular response is to Jess's comment that the Greenpeace office in India was pretty well knocked down. And I'm wondering what is it that we might be able to do from Australia to assist the people in Greenpeace India to recover from this, to push back?
Wow, thanks. That's a really nice question. We have a number of appeals. The Australia Pacific office ran a fundraising appeal with all of that to go over to the Indian office. So that's one very direct, practical thing that we can do. But then I'd say the second thing we can do is we can knock out the power of these kinds of companies in Australia so that there's less of a reason to attack Greenpeace India. So we need to kind of do our part of the job. We need to attack the power here so that that leaves them free to do their job.
The last point you made about referring to experts. Now, the assumption is a lot of the experts will be in Parliament or in Canberra. My question to you is, can you elaborate on when you say the last couple of years we've been inundated with so much bullshit pretty much that we don't know who is an expert and who is an opinion mouthpiece. So if you were to provide information to so-called the experts, could you actually expand and highlight who these kind of experts are? Who are they? Are they scientists? Are they engineers? Are they politicians? Are they lawyers? Accountants? Because by giving it to people who are often inappropriate to make decisions, they're the ones that actually change the topic and take it off course. And as a result, you actually miss the whole point of what we're trying to achieve. So could you please elaborate on who are the so-called experts of the future?
Sorry, who was it directed at?
Sorry, to Jessica, as in something tangible, because a lot of people are finding our discussion is often hijacked by people who seem to not understand the full concepts. And so unless we are tangible with who exactly are we directing that bit of information, a lot of people are actually confused and actually sort of miss the point of what we're trying to achieve.
So I think on the subject of who is an expert climate scientist, I would go to the climate scientists. Sorry, this is not a facetious answer, but we know 97% of climate scientists agree that we're heading towards the exceeding of the 2-degree limit. On renewables policy, I'd go to the renewables experts, but what this government's done is gut organisations like ARENA on kind of the experts to work out what's the best climate policy for Australia. We had the Climate Change Authority set up again. They were experts, they were gutted. I think we need, public institutions full of experts making decisions in the public interest, and that's who we should rely on. And what we've seen is the gutting of all of those those public institutions full of experts in the last couple of years. And so what I would like to see is their institutional place built back up.
Section 5 and sacred sites at Barrett Peninsula, WA.
I mean, this is not with my, institutional hat on, but my personal response to that, I know what you're referring to, and I think it is a very sad indictment of, the Western Australian government in 2015 that they think it's appropriate for them to define what is a sacred site for the traditional custodians of Western Australia.
That's somewhere you have to worship once a week rather than 50,000-year-old Aboriginal art cave-ins, 1 million of which are in the Barrett Peninsula where the oil and gas is going to go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Now, the speakers tonight, you were all spellbound. I was spellbound. Whoa. It was a wonderful combination. Whoa. It was a pure thing. I've never heard. I've been doing this for 27 years. I would say that these two wonderful women showed that combination of a really brilliant intelligence and knowledge in the way they answer the question,
with a passion for the possible, and actually carrying out the passion, that we can make a difference if we actually combine together and use the sort of creative energy that all of us have got, but these two wonderful women have actually manifested for us. You have been an inspiration for all of us, and I want us all to really show how much we appreciate tonight. Now, the announcement I want to make before any of you go away is that next week's topic flows on from tonight's, and it is a very special night. We've called it the Pope Francis encyclical on climate change and global inequalities.